in.
Great. So I will start sharing my screen. Yeah, so the project I'm working on is improvements for a query builder. So basically taking like some areas and trying to make them a bit better and understandable. And the focus is on the segment component, which apparently confuses a lot of people. So, but I'll go through like some of the improvements and I'll see what your thoughts are. So the first one is basically not having inline labels and putting them on top of the inputs instead. So if you just look here and compare this row, for instance, I find this easier to scan and read. This does add, and I think the apprehension against having top labels in the query builder is that they take up more space, but in some cases they do, but in other cases you can actually save space since it's easier to stack them horizontally rather than vertically, which is quite common now in the query builder. So that is like one area. And then it's also sort of how we add and remove the segments. So that this works very differently in different data sources where you sort of delete things and add things and so forth. And for a unified way, my simple suggestion is basically that when you add things in a row, you have it on the right side. And if you add it like a new row, add row, so you basically just have it at the bottom and just try to keep that consistent. And when you have them in a row, you basically have them things to sort of remove the items on the actual item rather than having a trash can anywhere. And then you would sort of combine them into adding stuff in a row and adding rows, and then you can remove the whole row or just items inside the row. And then we move on to the actual segment component. So in the current implementation, you could see something like this, that you have like a key equals value situation. But you can't really see which parts you can interact with or not. So this could be a drop-down, 3 drop-downs that can just look at that you can change. Or it could be 2 drop-downs and an input. Or it could be a drop-down, a non-interactive item, and then an input. So this is really confusing for the user. And also what the drop-downs looks like can also be quite confusing. So my suggestion is basically that we actually use in like drop-downs and inputs rather than this thing that looks like a label. And but the issue here is then like how will you remove them, because then you will have like clusters of inputs that should be able to be removable and addable. So this is just like having some sort of cross somewhere that sort of removes it. This is my initial sort of idea, having it in the first one, but then it looks like you can only remove the first one. But maybe some sort of interactable effect. Basically, if you hover it or focus the X, it can maybe outline the whole thing that will be removed or something like that. So how would it sort of work in the product? It would basically be you have this sort of segment group and you would add a segment. And then depending on the sort of segment, it could be like this version or this version, and then you could sort of continue to add with the plus and continue adding them, and also having either and or an and or, depending on also the needs for that data source and that sort of segment that is needed. And also when you add rows, then you would have a new row, and then you could also sort of add segments inside that row. And then you have this pattern again, then with the trash can that removes the whole row, or you had the plus to add segments stuff inside the row, and then you can also remove parts of the row. So what would this look like in the actual product? So I have 2 examples. So this is what it could look like in CloudWatch, where you have the first options here, basically setting up the metric, where you find the stuff and so forth. And then you have these dimensions, which then would just work like an inline segmenting, where you add new dimensions, and you get these 3 drop-downs that you can sort of pick what you want. And here you also have this and or that will come up each time you add a new dimension. So this actually does not take up a lot more space than the one with inline labels. And I do think it's sort of less intimidating looking than the current one. So this is this is a bit more like a UI people are used to seeing, I would say. And it also sort of reflects a bit more what the actual cloud products do themselves. So in another case where it actually does take up more space is in InfluxDB. So this is what this could look like in InfluxDB with this system. So here you also have then where you can add new fields. So currently when you add a field, you get sort of a field and then you get something that manipulates it, as I understand it. So in the current implementation, when you click plus, you either pick a new row or another item to the row. So here it's quite clearly that here you add a new field, and here you can add new sort of items to that segment. And yeah, that's what I have. So I want to hear your thoughts. This is sort of still quite early exploratory. So basically just to see like if I'm going in the right direction here or if there's any clear issues that is standing out.
I think it's a great exploration that you have done. And yeah, I agree that having labels about input fields is pretty much like the standard and the best usability or accessibility practice that you could have. Two things that I'm wondering. So for the segment component itself, why not follow the other patterns that we have for remove/delete and have that inline remove on the right-hand side of things as opposed to the left? So where you say in this case, you have, pretty much the X could be on the right. I think it's the most used pattern. And the only other thing that I'm thinking, but probably that just will raise complexity on the front-end side, is I'm thinking of the screen that the user has, right? Some might have very large screens and versus narrow ones, and depending on how they use their computer. So could maybe the user select how they want to see the labels, if they want to see them above the input fields or inline? It could be like a personal preference to save some of the space and fit items better.
Yeah.
But I think overall, it's a good exploration. And let's see who else wrote after me. I think it was Teddy wanted to ask a question.
I wanted to discuss the like closing out or deleting a portion of the segment or the whole segment. I don't know if I'm using the correct language, but if you scroll a little bit to the left, you're exploring having the X just in the first drop down, but if you click it, then it would, oh, you already passed it. Yeah, there. So
okay,
yeah, I know that you're already creating a lot more space by making them drop downs instead of tags. But what if you added more and added a container around them and then put the X floating in the container outside of the drop down? I think although it takes up more space, it just makes it more explicit that when you click the X, you're deleting the entire segment and not just a portion of it.
I think it's an interesting comment, Teddy. The one but I think what needs exploration is what happens if you have like this extra container. What happens when you will have like 6 rows with this additional container, because that can be a massive visual clutter. I don't know, but it's just a thought, like it's interesting to try this, but we should try this also like in extreme version to make sure this is not too much visual clutter if we do that.
Yeah. Is it even possible to just delete a portion? So if I were to delete the value, like, is that possible, or is the only option to delete the whole thing?
So the thing is that it's sort of, you can't really, the key has no point here without the value, basically.
Right.
So you basically, it's like a package deal. So for instance, in Influx now, you basically have this sort of label thing. I can show you like this, where you basically have a thing that looks like this, and then you can click it and change the whole thing, or you can click like inside the parentheses to just change the value. So yeah.
So the drop downs are making that process of editing it more explicit.
Yeah,
I do think that
precisely.
it almost gives the impression having the delete icon inside of the key drop down is a
Yeah.
bit.
Yeah, definitely. So I mean, so that is like one of the things that I haven't really explored enough, and it's really early. It's just like the idea is that you should be able to delete the whole thing, but I'm not really sure how to indicate it yet.
It could
So
help. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, go ahead.
Maybe it could help wherever you choose to put the X, that when you hover over it, there's a tooltip that says delete segment or delete whole segment.
Yeah, so I thought maybe something that could sort of highlight the whole area that is deleted could be a way of doing it.
Cool. Other than that, I think it looks great. I agree with everyone that having the drop downs makes it more explicit and is just a common pattern that is used in a lot of other tools. So it's more familiar to the users. I think who is next after me is Peter.
Yeah, so hey guys, I maintain Graphite Query Editor, which uses segments very heavily. So that could be that like extreme case, because in Graphite you basically use segments to build a metric name, and it can be like a very, very long list. In Graphite you also have this pattern with key value for tags and functions, and they're all segments, and it's like super confusing how to delete and what to delete. Sometimes you just click away on something, sometimes you put empty value. I guess users just got used to how it works and how to make it work, but it's not really clear. So I really like this, how it makes it very clear what can be changed, how, and what can be removed. And my only concern is that with Graphite, you may have like a lot of drop downs like this. So with segments, what I like is like it's super readable. So you can have like multiple queries. Each query can have a lot of segments, and you can just read them like it was a text. And only when you have to edit it, you actually display this drop down. With all these drop downs, it depends on the design, I guess, but it may be more cluttered and more basically less readable. Like the query itself may become less readable, because I think this is also an important aspect. It's not only for editing and changing, but also to read, basically to see what is inside the query, and readability is also important here. But yeah, I really like how it becomes more explicit with especially with this X to delete like the key value pair or entire row.
Cool. Yeah, I think one of the things there is just that, I mean, Graphite is the extreme case, and it's also like every other data source query builder is sort of based on the Graphite one, which is quite good for Graphite, but much less so for basically any other query builder, I would say. So that is definitely a challenge.
Yeah, Josh had a point in chat about that.
Amy, I think you also wanted to ask something.
Yep. So just a couple of notes on labels. One is that I really like the labels on top of the drop downs rather than on the side. I think that helps considerably. But the other thing when I was thinking about labels is that Ryan demonstrated something to us yesterday that was using the term dimensions for what I think was something different. So we'll just want to make sure that in terms of that phrasing, we're careful about what things are sharing names.
Yeah, so the thing that with the naming is that we use the names the data source uses. So for instance, if you could
Okay.
compare, I think it's like Azure and CloudWatch, they use the same terms, but for totally different things. So that's why the labels can sometimes be confusing if you go from one data source to another one.
Got it. Okay.
Okay, any other feedback that you'd like to give, Patrick? Like we have 1 more minute, 2 more minutes. All right. Thank you, Patrick, for presenting.
Thank you.
Eddie, I think you are next.
Yes, I have a couple of things. And I know that I think Lukash and, oh, no, they deleted their sign up. So I guess I have the rest of the time. First, I'm going to show the table component. I've been doing some explorations with the table component to address 2 main issues. Issue 1 is that with the themes update, my opinion is that the zebra striping makes the table sort of like not grounded, especially when it's a complex table with a lot of elements in it, like buttons and text links and icons and things like that. And then secondly, I just found that we have inconsistency across the whole app in terms of what our tables look like. I'm working on designs to translate a mixer, the IRM app that we just acquired, translating their UI to ours. And I couldn't recommend which table we used because we have so many. So that's sort of like what got me started on this. But I'll share just my explorations. And members of the UX team have already added a lot of comments. So thank you for that. I have not had time to go through them yet because I had a lot of meetings yesterday. But essentially, I started looking at where we have tables in our app. We have some zebra striping in some places. And as you can see, one of every other row is actually the same as the background color. And then in other places, we have sort of like a horizontal line that divides them. And so I thought of these 2 methods of separating rows as sort of like the main ways to separate rows. I haven't explored any versions other than that, but I was thinking how to use these 2 things, but ground the table more against the background. And so I created a couple options with some zebra striping to both ground the table against the background and also sort of like more differentiate what the header is. And so here's a simple table using zebra striping and then a complex table there, like tags and inputs and links and buttons and expandable rows. And as you can see, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to differ. But when you have expandable rows and more complex items, I think the table, it becomes really jarring to the eye against the background because this expanded row is the same color as the background. So this was one option. I created another option where it has sort of like a container behind it so that you can see that this component exists and it's all one thing. And then here was another option where it has just a simple border around it to, again, ground the table against the background. And so these were some options I created with zebra striping to help sort of like ground it against the background. And then, oh yeah, here it is in light mode. So the same options, but in light mode. And then I created some options where there isn't zebra striping, but there are instead horizontal borders on the rows. And the intention with this was to sort of create some more consistency among the rows so that every row looks similar. And so that better groups the table together as one component against the background. So this is one option. And then in light mode. And then here's an option where actually the background color of the row is our secondary background color. And so it really stands out against the background. And this is what it would look like in light mode. And then finally, one more option where there is a grounding container behind it. So any comments, questions?
Hey, Teddy, I have one question.
Mhm.
What's the maximum number of rows that we have in tables so far in the product?
That's a good question. And I wasn't able to figure it out through just like some discovery and playing around in the tool. I found that we have different max rows in each table. It's not built into, like, the max rows and pagination isn't built into the table component in our components library. If, at least I think
Right.
so. Yeah, so whoever's implementing it implements different rules along with it. So we have that inconsistency throughout the app.
I think
We
though, that,
all-
like, sorry, if I, just very quickly, like, I think though, if I'm looking at this for like to using an Azure Monitor for our resource picker, and that is theoretically an infinite amount of rows in that, because we're just visualizing someone else's resource in there, which I think is a very common thing for us to do in Grafana.
To answer Anya's question, there are situations where we should avoid using pagination because you have to see the whole thing at once. For example, in alerting, you don't want to miss an alert that is on another page and it's firing. And we have cases where pagination actually makes sense. For feedback for Teddy, personal preference. I like both the option with just a border around the table because it doesn't add up space to the existing table. If we are going to do a padding around it, probably we'll break a few areas here and there. They also like even more the option where we ditch the zebra and we go for having lines because that could allow us to have highlighting on hover. So when you look at a big table, it could be maybe even easier to highlight only the row that you are currently looking at. And in all cases, I really like seeing that table column, the row header being more obvious, like exactly what you are showing right now. It makes it a lot easier to follow. Let's see who else added a comment. I think Amy, you wanted to ask a question.
Yes, and I just want to understand in terms of like a goal for this work, are we looking to unify to one table style overall, or are we looking to have a border option and a zebra option overall?
That's a good question. My intention would be to sort of like agree upon standards and design for the table and to use that going forward. Potentially at some point, if we're updating like a page or a table on an existing part of the app, then we might update the component. But I don't know what like bandwidth teams have to be able to go back through the app and be able to like unify the design of the table. Like, I'm not sure that that's very practical.
Right. But I mean, like in terms of like choosing a design, do we want to choose one or two, understanding that it will be a sort of rolled out approach to updating?
Yeah, I think if there's a really solid reason for using two designs and that we have clear standardized rules about when to use table A and when to use table B, my opinion is that is fine. But it's sort of just like personal preference, or we say, oh, well, this table works better on this part and then this table works better on the other part. That's just going to encourage like a lot more inconsistency.
Yep. Okay. Thank you. And then I had another question, which is that in terms of, I know that this is an exploration and we're kind of narrowing it down, but once we get down to some kind of like front runners, is it possible to run some A/B tests on these and get some like community feedback? Is that something we can do?
I think with A/B testing, it can be a bit tricky because that is really a hard way to evaluate this based on A/B testing. but that's actually something I also commented on. Like, for me, it's also personally the alternating row colors are easier on eyes. Like, it's easier to look at it than having tons of lines, especially with possibly endless tables. But that being said, I'm pretty sure, because it's like a UI thing, I'm pretty sure there's a bunch of like eye tracking research around this, or research that tells what is the best practice there. And I think we should simply follow best practice and what was researched there when we make this decision. And also, I fully agree on making this like a standard design for tables. Like, we shouldn't be switching between two types of tables. We should design the one that is the best based on like research that is there and best practice, and just stick with it instead of having like two types of tables to choose from, because we will never get the consistency. We already have a ton of different tables in the product. So yeah, so my like recommendation and piece of feedback would be to maybe now check what's there when it comes to best practices and research on this, and then take it from there.
Patrick did find a good article about zebra striping, and the eye tracking research that they reference is like very nominal, and the like outcome of the article is essentially like some people think it's better and some people think it's worse. It's like, I'm sure that there's more research out there to be done as well, but that was sort of like what I read from the article.
We have places in Grafana right now where we have a table and it doesn't have a zebra pattern.
Yeah.
So even now we are talking inconsistencies, because yeah.
I really like the dashboards table.
I think here's sort of what we define as a table or not. For I think when this was created, it was more seen like a list of folders rather than a table.
Yeah, it was. It wasn't considered as a table. It was considered a list when we designed this.
Okay, that makes sense.
This work looks great though. As a developer, I am really excited to see some. I'm really excited about the possibility of having standardized styles and components for this, because we implemented a whole bunch of custom stuff for like within Azure Monitor that I would love to delete and not have that code hanging around. So this looks awesome. I'm very happy about this.
Oh, I wonder if we could take like an approach, like try to figure out on the core Grafana features, in how many places we use zebra style tables and where we don't. We don't use it for data tables behind a panel. For example, we have only lines. We use zebra tables on the other hand in alert. And I'm sure there are examples, but maybe we can count what we have and just choose the option.
That might actually be something that I would request that our team helps with. I pulled a couple, like just literally 2 examples here, and I wanted to do more of that, just like sort of do an audit of our tables. But I realize I just don't have a lot of features in my Grafana accounts. Like, I know a lot of enterprise features have tables, and I just don't have access to those things. And I guess I'm just wondering if maybe that's something we could collaborate on as a team, is pulling in examples of tables just here so that we can look at all of them. Just some screenshots that could be really helpful.
Sure, it's a good idea. And also,
Drop me the Figma link and I'll pop some in.
Yeah. You can, Ted, you can also, like, what usually works with stuff like that, just publish in UX channel that whoever's there just to like, because those don't have to be designers, right?
Right.
Probably engineers have even better overview what they're putting tables. So just ask everyone to contribute to this exploration.
That sounds good.
Thank you, Teddy, for this awesome exploration with tables. I think it was long due.